I just use these tools so much, and they're just such a central part of what I'm working on. I just find them so genuinely useful that I think that just to even talk about MCP means to talk about a lot of things, which are very interesting to me in terms of just what they mean for software and just even just how they've exposed me to other technologies that I found useful and educational. The new spec came out in March, which allowed it to be essentially hosted remotely. And that's when I became really aware of it. Actually, Ray was the one who brought it to my attention. And since then, I started working on creating servers. And then I ended up making a server for Xano to basically to build on Xano using MCP. And that was the first time I started using it. And I thought, this is very cool. This is very useful, genuinely for me. And then I started working on, let's just make it OAuth protected, right? Because I can share with other people. And that was also quite an experience in just even doing that. And then I thought, well, let's make it better. And then led to other questions of how do you make this thing be more MCP friendly in the sense of like the endpoints themselves? How can you even then take this further to put workflows in them and all these other questions? And then actually something that I did recently was I made an MCP server for connecting over to Universe. I don't know if you know about Universe databases, but it's like a 30-year-old technology, the most archaic technology that you can possibly, it's literally green screen. And so all those developers are retiring out of that space. And so that's actually a very big industry because those are like legacy systems that they seek to expand their lifespan. And then, so I made an MCP server that essentially just that allows the AI to directly input those commands, like those archaic commands, which nobody really is familiar anymore. That's something that was actually very surprising, like just very easy, actually a lot easier than the Xano one to do. Like that one worked almost instantly. And so there's so many applications for it. And for me, I'm trying to stretch I've been spending a lot of time with the Xano one, but I'm trying to also now stay in my cave and I'm always building stuff. And so this is like a way for me to just be able to also see what's going on with the market and then also be able to see what's interesting, right? Because if I'm always staring at one thing, I'm not necessarily seeing everything else going on around me. But yeah, like that's a little bit about my interest in the things that I'm doing with the MCP tool. I've gone super deep with building them and I find that it's fun to talk about it.
So do you have a business? Do you so right now it sounds like these are like passion projects, or is the idea like, what is the application? What is the great, here's a cool technology.
The thing is that as I put out this stuff more and more, it raises reputation in the market because I've been doing this pretty consistently since March and my profile is all MCP oriented. I have people who put up their hand through in my inbox. So they'll say, hey, I'm building MCP server. Can you help me? And that's where the business starts. But let's say for this, for example, then, okay, I'll take this recording. I'll put it up. I'm not it's not like I'm selling anything here and I don't have to, right? We're just here to talk and that's my pleasure. And that's part of just also giving back to the market. And then whoever wants to do a paid engagement, those are people who self-select themselves, right? Like they will make it very obvious that they want to work with me. So yeah, that's where the business part of it comes into it. I want to build MCP servers and there are people who want that. And this is how I make it clear that I could do that.
Problem do you see that solving for people?
A lot of the time, people come in with their own problem. They've already defined, hey, here's where I see it fitting into, and it's like, it's not like an idea that I'd come up to somebody and start to pitch them like from zero that, hey, I'm going to build you an MCP server and this is why you need one. A lot of the time they are already most of the way there and they've educated themselves on what it is. And then they think, oh, this is mostly what I want. But let's say where there's a value in it for them is because it's tricky. It's just a tricky thing to implement because it requires bridging over a lot of different technologies. If you want it to be easy for people to plug into it, right? And you want it to be future proof and you want it to be OAuth protected and all those things and optimize, there's a few headaches that you have to go along the way to get that all going smooth together. And so I'm pretty helpful with that.
Gotcha. I have one more question and then I'll let people talk. So I'm like learning and creating mental models to understand what it is. Because I've interacted for the first time with a MCP with Linear. to create product requirements, all that stuff. And I'm like, wow, this is super cool. And what I'm imagining is you are able to hook up your backend to the user interface of ChatGPT, Claude, whatever. And at least in linear, it had, oh, this is to get stuff, this is to add stuff, this is basically. And what I'm imagining is like those are different like APIs that you would have connected. And then you talk to whatever chatbot to say, and it knows which one to pull from. And then on the back end, because part of me is one use case that I'm thinking about using is instead of me creating like a CRM for myself to manage my business, experiment building out a MCP server type thing for me to interact with my business operations via like Claude. And I'm trying to wrap my head around what that could look like because I need to add people to the CRM. And then there's some workflow management stuff saying, oh, like here's an opportunity that ties to this person. And is that just a matter of having APIs for each thing?
I think that you pretty much, that is the way to look at it in the sense of it is APIs that don't necessarily have to map one to one with another API. It can be a series of steps that goes and says, for example, let's say within the context of the Xano MCP that I made, like there would be, let's say a person wants to make an endpoint, and then there's a few questions that, like if you look at it as a linear process that can be combined into just that question of, okay, creating an endpoint means you need an API group on Xano means so there can be a check first to see, is there an API group? And then, okay, does it exist? Yes, no. If it doesn't exist, create the API group. And then also return that as part of the information. So like you can do a whole bunch of stuff within one request, and it could be very sophisticated and go into any direction that you can imagine, depending on the context of what we're talking about. But I find that it's a really good way to combine the speed and a coverage that the LLM is able to do, especially when you have 3 agents working at once. They're able to cover so much ground and execute. And by you leveraging that power into more like linear workflows where you get that more predictability out of it as well, I think it starts to serve your system, or it can solve a lot of problems that are in a very unique way, which I found with the Xano one, in the sense of I could get a balance of, okay, speed, but I want predictability. I want to build things a certain way. So I'm really defining tight rules within what it's able to execute very fast. So I'm getting that balance.
So it sounds like there's agents that are like underneath the umbrella of the MCP concept.
Yeah, I would say, like, for example, have you ever used Claude Code before?
I have seen other people use it. I have, because I don't
So I
always
think
know what
that
it's doing.
it's quite a nice experience in the sense of, let's put it this way. You have one AI that you're discussing with, and then can launch other instances of itself, basically. So each of those instances of itself can go out and use the same tools, the same MCP tools that the agent that dispatched them has access to. So now you have, for example, like 3 agents using the Xano tool, all of them doing research all at the same time into different aspects. And then they come back with an amazing amount of coverage. And then you can just imagine that with all kinds of different situations and executions.
So like human resources, where it's like, okay, if I need to get a task done, or let's say like I'm a business owner, there's a general manager, and the general manager delegates it to this person to then just get the work done.
Yeah, actually, yes, you can see it that way. And it does work nicer within that context of giving it a to-do list, essentially, or like a PRD, which you parse into tasks. The reason why it's nice to use sub-agents is because it preserves your context window. Instead of making it be super long, which degrades the quality of the conversation over time, each of them are going into their own instance where they're executing their code, receiving their detailed instructions, but they're not returning back every single thing that they're doing. They're executing their task, and then they're giving back a detailed report at the end. And so you're keeping that valuable, whatever, like mental or spiritual place that the LLM is at, which is like that sweet spot that you've communicated everything that you want to it. You're not losing that. Like you're able to get it to execute. Hey, go send out 3 agents, do a huge amount of work, come back, and we're still in the same spot. It hasn't slowed down mentally, and it hasn't become distracted like from the main task. Yeah, There, that's and I appreciate also that it just might sound abstract if you haven't used Claude Code a little bit, but that's I just recommend also using Claude Code because it's really MCP friendly. I would say it's really easy to drop them in, just like with one command line command, you can just easily drop it in.
Okay. So to synthesize what you said, using my analogy of the general manager, whatnot, like you preserve the context window because each employee underneath the like general manager can always go back to the general manager to say, hey, what do I need to know about this thing that I'm trying to do? And each individual thing has its own context window.
Yeah,
Employee.
each of them are like in their own little world, basically. And actually, one thing that's interesting about it is you can actually even give commands actively. Well, sometimes I'll have three of them working, and you can drop in another command, which is to say, hey, I think that you should, by the way, pay attention to this. And this is actually something recently that they've added where once you put in that command, it won't sit and just wait outside until the three of them finish. It'll actually put it into it'll inform them of that. And so sometimes I'll be watching them do their thing, and then I'll think I forgot to tell them. I noticed one of them just did this thing, went into the wrong file. I can tell that it's going in the wrong direction. Instead of stopping them, I can say, hey, by the way, that's not the right place. And then I'll see it in real time, just switch and start to come back to where I want it to be. So you get some very nice efficiency out of it, right? Like in a world where AI can give you a lot of headaches, to be productive with it, I've forced myself to, I think dogfooding it has become a good way to phrase it, like with the way of trying to find what works best. And that's what I found works best is like some type of flow in there.
Gotcha.
Cool. It's a pleasure. Shane, how are you doing?
Hello. Very well, thank you. How about yourself?
Good. Pleasure to meet with you and happy to talk about whatever is on your mind if you have anything about MCP.
Likewise, yeah, I wouldn't mind picking your brain if that's okay. I see your new video on YouTube yesterday saying you've been doing intensive work on the Snappy tool that you're hopefully releasing next week. And one little bit that intrigued a little thought was saying that you've managed to reduce the amount of front-end tools, but implement them into the middleware into Sano. And I thought that was quite a fantastic idea, really. And just wondering if I could pick your brains on how you managed to come to that conclusion of doing that in the first place.
It's interesting because I put it into a middleware, but I didn't put it onto Xano. I actually deployed it onto, so far at least, I've deployed it onto Fly. And I think that it's just a nice way to separate your concerns because that way I can let the MCP tool be what it needs to be, which is more or less just communicating, just executing its tools. And then I can focus on the middleware as a separate part of the system, which contains this more sophisticated logic and SDK and everything else that can essentially just assume that whatever request is going to receive are going to be the equivalent of curl requests. And so then I can simulate the MCP at that point, making those requests just to the middleware. And I can just really refine that experience. And I suppose the way that I came about it was I thought I already did it without realizing it. I did with some of the tools, like there's a few tools in it that are like the basic type tool and advanced, and there's to create a whole bunch of different schema types. And that's already 3 tools that combine like probably 25 to 30 tools if I was to break them up. So then I thought, okay, I can just take that and just maybe just apply that to everything else as well. It just become different requests. And then the next thought was the thing that's really annoying is making endpoints because the amount of XanoScript you have to generate is so long. That's what I'm trying to solve right now, which is to create those endpoints. So I'm sure like you've used the tool, so you know how it is with trying to create endpoints. Like XanoScript does not come easy to an AI.
No, it does. I think it's fantastic what you've done, but sometimes I do get the odd occasional error if it's trying to build an API endpoint that has a custom function. I find that it can't build that because I don't know if it knows how to use the correct syntax to connect to the custom function. But if it hasn't got a custom function, it's fantastic. It'll just do its thing and build it. And it's saved me quite a lot of time over the last month alone. I'm very grateful if you're putting the time and effort into doing it to share with us, really.
Go
One
ahead.
thing I think from watching a lot of Ray's videos, I think because of the time difference, unfortunately, I don't get to come along to a lot of the meetings, but I'm always watching every day. And it pushed me to do an MCP. So I'm currently building my software at the moment, which is going to benefit my joinery business, basically. And I'm finding that the Claude chat, so I basically made a roadmap in Claude, gave it some knowledge and go through the chat to make sure I'm on the right path and get a little bit of help here and there. And I find that the chats obviously max out quite a lot. And so I went from saving the Claude chats onto Google Docs, and then finding that was quite difficult. So then I heard Ray talking about Vectara. So I actually built my own little MCP that I back up all my chat from Claude from into Vectara. And then when I come to a new chat now, it literally calls the MCP, does a quick search on Vectara, pulls back the relevant information. And I can't believe how quick it picks up and knows exactly where we left off. So that's been a massive game changer to me. And then one thing I did learn during that build is actually being able to alt from Claude Desktop to Sano. So I've realized that when you're in Claude Desktop and you're calling the Sano, the Claude is connecting through the back end of Sano. So the only way that I worked out to do that is to make my own private key. And then when I call my MCP, I tell it to, this is the query, and you need to also send this secret key. So then that goes in, and then Sano checks if that secret key matches mine, just to make sure that there is some alt scan on. I'm not sure if there is a better way to do the alt from Claude.
So, sorry, just to make it clear, you're talking about to do the auth from Claude to within what context of, yeah, just to get some more clarity there.
So watch the video from what Ray's done before, and when you can make your own, you get your dynamic URL from Sano for like your MCP endpoint.
Yes.
And then, for instance, I've done that and then added a UUID to the end of the URL. But then what I found is when Claude actually connects to the MCP in Sano, it's actually triggering it from the back end. It doesn't actually use the URL that you provided. So there was no way for me to actually, from any of the headers that get received into Sano, there was no way of actually getting the correct URL because it's completely different to the one that I should be sending. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
The challenge is you want to make sure that's only Claude that's able to talk to your MCP and not anybody else.
Basically, yeah. So then I know with some of them, you can put your like UUID at the end of the URL string, can't you? And then you can then connect that to a table to check if there's the unique ID. So the only way that I've managed to do a workaround on it is because it wasn't called in the dynamic URL that I was providing it, is every time that Claude does a call, it sends a query string and also queries a secret key. So then in Sano, I've just built a table and just created a UUID basically, and it just checks it that way. So technically the MCP is open to anyone, but if they don't send the query string and the pass key, they won't get in.
Got it. So the way I do it is I've got put the passkey or the UUID directly into the URL path, right? Because it goes MCP, then something, then MCP again. And you can use that as part of your validation using middleware or whatever on a pre-authentication basis, because that they call it token under the covers. I think I put this stuff into one of the videos I made about this up on YouTube. And that's the way that I handle security. That way, like for example, people then state change, right? We have a state change MCP server, but the state change MCP server for you is different from the state change MCP server for say Robert or for me, right? They're all authenticated based on who we are. And then that way, nobody else gets access to that unless they get access to your URL, in which case you can invalidate your URL and get a new one issued because creating UUID is relatively cheap.
But what the problem is, when Claude actually connects to a tool through the MCP in Sano, it doesn't send the URL that Sano provides me. So say, for instance, sano.com/MCP/my UUID. It won't, because it's making an internal call. So the URL is actually totally different to what it should be called in. So I think when back and forth, when Claude first connects, when you first open Claude on your desktop, when it first makes that connection, it will do the alt flare, but then anything after that will be a different URL.
It's a different, it is a different URL, but the same path up to the point where it says SSE or stream at that point.
Okay.
So if you add it using the query string, like using question mark approaches, that stuff gets lost and that approach doesn't work. But if you put it inside the path before you hit the /SSE or /stream, if you this, if you go to mcp.statechange.ai, you can see our state change server and see where we put in the UUID. And you'll see that because it goes in as part of the path, that part is getting preserved. Because you're right, the URL is changing, but the first part, the base part of the URL doesn't change. It's only the part after that kind of gets exploded, or at least that's what should be happening.
Interesting. I'll have to have a look back because, so I tried to, one of the first things I've done is when I connected the MCP, I've done a stop and debug and extracted all the headers to find out what was put in. And I couldn't see any that my UUID was.
Yeah, and the stop and debug is not going to tell you very much. So if you use stop and debug to test this, you're going to actually find you don't get nearly as much information. Yeah, the thing is stop and debug is always going to be running in the context of the debugger, right? And the debugger is different from what actually runs in real time. So what I do in order to find out more about like how Claude is really talking to it is I will use an event log pattern, right? So I will have like data hey, based on the actual request that came in from Claude, we're going to go store this in database now, right? And I find that when I do that, I get a clearer view of what's coming in from Claude, which even like the request history doesn't help me with because of the way Xano handles this stuff internally. Because these aren't really, and this actually is an important idea about API, about the way MCP works. We often think about having these API endpoints, right? Where you're going to cold call up a URL, and that URL is the one that's going to be the thing you're talking to, right? MCP is a different protocol, and it sits underneath something called JSON RPC. And so what happens is that our friends at Claude go talk to the JSON RPC endpoint, which there's just one on your server over on your Xano instance or whatever. And then it's making a request into that JSON RPC, which is not a different URL. It's just a different payload that's getting wrapped up inside. And then that is then turning around and calling one of those other function stacks, which are your tools. So there's not a direct relationship between the call that's coming from Claude and what's actually getting run inside Xano. It's abstracting some of that complexity away from you, which is probably for the best because JSON RPC is a pain in the butt to work with. So the fact that you're not seeing the exact URL is normal, right? But the way you want to look at it is not by trying to look, but the way to get the information you're really looking for, which is that part of the URL, it has something, I think it's under a group they call toolset, and then it's called token. And then that is basically just including that piece in the URL that you would customize, the second MCP part. And then that will be consistently and that's being driven by the URL that Claude was calling. This is all a fairly primitive form of authentication. It's just the best that Xano has right now. And Xano actually is a leg up in terms of ease of use compared to some other tools. And Robert's been using like Cloudflare. I'm sure he can be speaking to like how the difference in experience using the Cloudflare SDK versus using the Xano approach. There's just a difference, right, between the system one APIs, which are like directly talking to an endpoint, versus system two, which is MCP, where you're actually talking through a tool that's exposed by a function that's exposed inside that one single endpoint. Just makes for a difference in kind. That means your diagnostic approach winds up being a little bit different. And the hints you would have used in world one don't help you nearly as much in world two. We need to train ourselves like looking at a different way.
Oh, shit. Fantastic. Thank you. Would you mind if I have to do a follow-up question? So you said that stop and debug wouldn't show me all the results, but it's best to save the information to the database. So if I was to, say, create a tool within MCP and then in my function stack, what's the best way to then save the information? Am I looking for like the HTTP headers, or is there a specific key that I'm trying to extract from what's coming in?
Yeah, so the thing you want, okay, first of all, you can extract the HTTP headers. They are available to you. And to get clarity on how the stuff works, I would even encourage like grabbing variables and then putting them into what I usually have an event log database. I use event log table I use for this, where I just add a record. Hey, here's the stuff I wanted to save based on what came through the door. And that gives me the opportunity to look at things to see how they work. I find that to be super helpful. But the way that I go about it is when I'm inside my state change, I will take a look at let's see if I were to look at, there's usually something under tool set. There's something called token, which comes from that second MCP and Zeno backend. Glad to show this to you in like office hours too over on, I appreciate the calendar doesn't always work for you on that. But that thing always gives you the results, that second part of the URL, which then you can use middleware or use it for authentication or whatever, just to make sure the right person's getting the right stuff.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I should look into that. Because I think you've got an MCP tomorrow, isn't it? The meeting tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to try and match that one tomorrow. Hopefully I might be able to pick your brains again.
Absolutely looking forward to it.
Robert, would you mind if I just ask one more question and pass it on?
Please.
So you were talking about Claude Code earlier. Have you compared the two different platforms? Have you found that one works better than the other?
Yeah, so I actually would highly recommend Claude Code over Claude Desktop for a lot of reasons, but especially to answer this question, I think I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you what I mean. But I was actually just looking at that when you mentioned it. But basically, looking at Claude Desktop, I haven't used Claude Desktop in quite a while, actually. I used to use it a lot, but that was maybe at the beginning when I was first getting into the MCP stuff. And then I just found that Claude Code was just superior, I felt, in any way that really mattered to me. This is me running it within Visual Studio. However, you can actually also run it in your terminal. But I prefer Visual Studio because I'm able to see my files alongside. And this is something that's a huge benefit for me, right? If I'm trying to do work, even if I'm doing work that actually doesn't require necessarily that it's not even a project that I'm going to deploy, it's still very useful for me to see my files and to see everything and not have it be like a black box. And when it comes to just the flexibility of Claude Code, it's very quite flexible. Actually, one thing to quickly show, if you want to add Claude Code into Visual Studio, you just literally type Claude and it'll pop up right there. So it's just really easy to plug it in. And then once it's in, you see this orange icon at the top. Once you click it, it's going to start up a new instance and automatically run right there for you. And if I type in /MCP, I'm going to see the MCPs that I have. And you can see that I have context 7. This is actually within a folder that has specific settings because I'm in this project right now. So if I were to go into another project, I'd have different MCPs. I could set them all up to be individual, which I do. And another thing is that there's features here such as agents, right? You can manage your agent configuration. I can create a new agent. Apologies if it's a little bit too small, but hopefully you can see that it says here you can create a new agent and it'll take you through this flow of, do you want to be personal or project? That's just the context if you want to apply to, where you want to apply to, how you want these settings to follow you around. And essentially you can set up these agents who have these pre-configurations that will better results because they're going to be specialized in, maybe one specialized in ShadCN, maybe one specialized in Xano. So when it's calling those sub agents, like we were talking about before, it's going to call these agents instead that have context that best fits the situation that you're calling them for. That's one feature that they released recently, which I don't think exists in Claude Desktop. And there's also just the fact of you can set up one thing that I have set up as well, something called hooks. So after every message or after every edit into a file, there's a script that runs that automatically does lint checking. And there's also another hook that I have set up, which backs up the conversation periodically, automatically. So all this stuff happens invisibly in the background. All of those things are reasons why I prefer to use Claude Code over Claude Desktop. And also just to quickly show, I think that's an interesting way to use MCPs in general, not so much looking at it in terms of building a server, but if you were using an MCP tool in an interesting way, I found is actually to use Playwright. So I don't know if anyone here has used Playwright via MCP, I think that it's very interesting when you start to give basically eyes and hands to the AI, which is what you do when you give a Playwright MCP access. And then it's able to actually launch a agent, which is, if you look at this, is actually something that I told it to, hey, you launch Playwright and iterate this because it's going to take it quite a while. I don't want to take screenshots and go and to lose my mind telling it this is what it looks like. Change this. I'm just going to have it launch sub agents and continuously take screenshots. I don't even have to look at the screen because it's in Playwright. It can be anywhere, and it's going to not only iterate visually, but it'll test the actual application and make sure that it's working. So this is like a demo for AGUI, but the point is that, you know, an MCP tool like this, for example, just gets you better results when you put it now into context of a sub agent that's continuously doing its work. But at the same time, what it's able to do is then also change this to mobile, then see what that looks like and iterate that version as well, and just test so many things and answer its own questions that when it comes back to you, it's going to be that much further along compared to if you hadn't given it this environment or this position for it to be able to execute this and to see while it's developing. I don't even know if that's possible to do with Claude Desktop. Maybe it is, but I just find that it's easier to deploy with Claude Code. So yeah.
Those look very impressive.
Cool.
Thanks so much for your time. I'll pass it on.
Oh, of course. I think, Sergio, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Doing great. Thanks for checking in. Just here listening to all the interesting questions. I don't have a question right now. I'm absorbing. But I appreciate your Claude Code suggestion and you insisting on it. I wasn't aware of Claude Code until last week. So I just have to take a look at it and check it out and see how I can start using it. But what you just shared was really useful. In regular Claude, you could use projects, so you could give it the context, and that's useful. But I do see that being able to see all your other folders that are attached to that,
it really makes it very dynamic because you're able to just change anything that you want at any time. And when you're in this position where you're working within Visual Studio, you could connect this. For example, I've connected it to Bolt, like have Bolt generate the front end that because Bolt, what is it good at? Just maybe making something that looks visually good, right? Just very quickly. Or I might use Vercel to spin up like a Next.js project. But the point is that from here, I can connect to it. And then from here, I can also connect to Xano with the Xano MCP. And so then I can have what I'll do is, if I wanted to get caught up with a project, just tell it, hey, go look at the Xano project, launch 2 sub agents, use the MCP tool, learn all about the project, then come back, give me a description of what that project needs, right? Because now you're able to you've seen every corner of it. So then we take that description. Now from this same position, let's work on the front end and let's make these 2 things connect. And it keeps me from being the bottleneck in the process, right? So I'm not the one who has to like copy paste everything. Like I can just tell it, look at this, now look at that, now look at this. And the process just becomes more of a...
it sounds really amazing. One thing I'm curious now, I do have questions then. In terms of agents, in Claude Code, do you program them by using context, the U architecture beforehand with different goals? And then do you just feed it? What kind of form do you share this context? Do you share documents with it? What is the most efficient form to share the context?
I find that in a lot of ways, the best form is actually for me the better that I can explain myself and the better that I can explain specifically what I want in my own words, then I find that the better results I get. And usually what I will do is refine it over a few back and forth with the AI, like my description of whatever it is that I want. And usually the way I'll get it out of me is actually just by recording myself speaking. Like I have a button, like a command that I'll just press this, for example, and then I'll just start speaking, and then it's just going to start recording me. And then when I finish speaking, I just hit the command and then it appears here at the bottom. So that's a way for me to very quickly be able to, I can really give a lot of
I do the
feedback.
same.
Okay. So
The same, and that helps. It's like literally life changing. So how about for ongoing projects that you have extensive contacts and you're creating, let's say, a group of sub agents to help you with this project? Let's just say research, right? Research is one thing that you could have agents be active during times that you're not active, perhaps. How does that work? Do you like, if I have pages and pages of context for one specific sub agent I have in mind, how do you share that with the Claude Code? How does that work?
I find that, so let's say if that project that we're talking about is a Xano project, let's say. So then what I'll do is I will have it launch a few sub agents, and I want to create a plan basically, right? So if I do shift tab twice, it'll switch over into plan mode. And essentially, this is interesting because by forcing it to do this, it actually, I tell it, go do this research, put together a plan. It's very obvious to me very quickly when I read the plan, whether or not it actually understands. Because if I actually read the plan and if I know the project, then I know stuff that stands out to me. When I force it to explain itself, it reveals very quickly what it missed. And that this is actually thing that brought me a lot better results. I will do this maybe 3 times back and forth with it until it has one hell of a plan that when I look at it, I'm like,
Nice.
that is the plan.
Nice.
And then now we're somewhere. And then that's something, then I tell it to execute that with sub agents. And I find that's actually really what gets things moving forward truly, like to get to that point. And it's also a great way for it to prove to you that it understands, because you're going to read that and you're going to be like, this is obviously not, like, you're going to read something in it that's going to make it so obvious how come it's been a headache in the past, because another thing that I do is I'm always constantly asking it the same question. I'm asking, are you 95% or more sure of the results? If not, you need to keep researching until you are, or ask me questions. I just literally keep saying that because it forces, and it's amazing how whenever I say that, all of a sudden it says, no, I'm only 70% sure. Like it will quickly reveal to you that actually it's not as confident as it was maybe implying before. So those are really just like those 2 things, just forcing it to plan and to show you the whole plan and to keep asking it to be at least 95% or more sure. I've noticed that I have been able to get results that actually run, like that they're true, that it's actually accurate, and it's not going down like completely wrong path and making things up.
Do you ever feel the need to have to start a new instance with that same sub agent, or you can keep, or just once you're with that same sub agent, do you just refresh it, or how does that work versus regular Claude?
Yeah, I think it's always better I found that it's always better to refresh, and it feels, I think that the more that I set myself up so I don't have that, I'm not getting too stuck with one, because they compound so much and they just degrade in quality. I think it compounds and then it's just not the same anymore. And I found that this is why it's also nice for me to work in this environment, because then I can just tell it, hey, create a handoff document. And like here, for example, actually, I have a handoff document that I asked it to do once before. I can read that document very easily because it's right there. And then I can just take this and then move on to the next agent very easily with it. I don't even have to copy paste it, which is actually a nice thing about working in Visual Studio, because you're also preserving your context window, because you're not copying and pasting the stuff. You're telling it the analogy of having the pebble in your shoe, like just having your stuff saved, and just an environment where you can save your stuff like this just means that you don't have to be executing a workflow where you're trying constantly copy pasting stuff.
A lot of the work that I'm doing in my projects has to do with architecture and just knowledge management. So how does that work in Claude Code? Because for instance, in regular Claude, you have different projects, and once you go into that project has different context documents, but that's the limit that you have. I wonder, is there more freedom here in terms of like how you create folders and stuff like that in Claude Code?
This thing can see everything, can do anything. It's actually, I have a script where I'll tell it to just arrange my downloads folder, because I'll have it just go do like digital housekeeping basically, or on my Mac. And so it has total ability to go into any files. And the thing is that if you open it from within a folder, then it'll constrain it to where you opened it, which is another maybe way to feel secure about what you're giving it access to. But from a more broad perspective, if I was to initiate it from all the way at the root, then it's going to have access to everything that propagates out from that. It also makes you look at the MCP tool, maybe like the Xano tool a little bit differently, because, for example, I want to upload files onto my Xano. I can take them straight from my desktop, tell the MCP tool AI, just take those files on my desktop, put them on my Xano workspace. Or it's weird because it creates like a different way to, it's like a data management tool almost. You're not even necessarily building something, but you're using it to move information, which is in itself the point of the functions in Xano. There's like a few, like the amount of ways, especially when you start from here and then you start to realize that you could connect this to GitHub directly and to anything really directly, and even to your own files. Once you start to think of it that way, you'll realize over time the things that you can do. Like they'll just start to pop in your head because it's impossible to even realize right now. Like all the
It's
possibilities.
infinite, really. It's exponential. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I agree. When you guys were exchanging a thought earlier, and you mentioned something, and it was like, oh, LLMs, and it's just context is beyond LLMs. It's like you could have the most intelligent infrastructure of anything that exists, and it's going to need that context. And so it's just like infinite avenues.
Also, just to say that Opus 4.1 was released yesterday. So it automatically just gets an upgrade, right? Like even in its own, without changing anything, and then maybe that's a reason why I like building MCP tools in general, is because it just moves with as the tide rises and all ships rise, right?
Exactly.
And so I didn't have to change anything. I don't know. I always think about this movie, Alien Romulus. I feel like nobody's seen this movie, but there's a scene where there's an android in the beginning of the movie. He's dumb. And in the middle of the movie, they change his AI and he just becomes super smart. And so that's how I feel like with the MCP tool. Like at first it was on 3.5, and then one day it got 3.7, and then I got 4, and then I got 4.1. And without changing anything, it just all of a sudden became a lot more intelligent and capable with just by the market and the offerings just becoming available. There's like an interesting phenomena there, and something that ties into the types of products that why I like building these products and so on.
Thank you, by the way, Robert. I just want to leave the
No,
space for anyone that may have questions or anyone that may want to talk about something.
Yeah, of course. No worries. It was a pleasure. And Demetrius, I just want to come around to you. Obviously, we've had our discussions, but pleasure to see you here.
Pleasure for me, guys. It's so cool what we saw today. I have a question. This is mentioned already from Brandon in the chat about the data privacy and security. It's not clear yet to me, even with your response rate. We store our data in Xano database, all right? And we're using, or any database, which is, let's say, secure, our own one. And we're using an LLM model, let's say Claude, for example, to access through MCP this data, analyze them, and give us back some results. Now, the question is, where is the privacy of those data? Or how can we guarantee the privacy of those data?
The chain of events is you to your front end to the back end of the LLM, the back end of the LLM to your MCP server, your MCP server to the database. Okay. So we can think of each of those as being links in a chain, right? And the question is, what's the security of each of those? Let's say, for the sake of argument, the state change MCP server works with a combination of data that is sitting inside Xano as well as like over on Vectara, right? We talked about that system there before. So I trust data at rest in Vectara. If I trust the integrity of the HTTPS, right? The secured HTTP, what's called transport layer security between Xano and Vectara, then I have that link sorted, at least from where I sit, right? I trust them. I trust Vectara as a vendor. I trust HTTPS as a standard because I understand how cryptography works. I'm okay so far. Then there's, do you trust Xano, right? As a node in that chain. And to the extent that I do trust Xano, and any data that's stored inside Xano, as well as anything that's running inside Xano, I generally trust. Next layer, okay, I'm using HTTPS communication again to go, because that's how the JSON RPC works, to go from Xano back up to our friends at, say, Anthropic, if we're talking about Claude. And then, so now data is being transmitted to Claude, and Anthropic has access to all that information, which is going to use for the purpose of processing summaries or creating interfaces or whatever for us. A reasonable question is, are they going to take that data and start using it for training or something? And the answer is maybe, but that's under your control. There's like a checkbox you can flick, right? Say whether or not you want to allow your conversations to be used for their training. If you use the API, the answer is never. They won't do it that way. If you really are worried about working with Anthropic directly, you can route it through one of the major cloud vendors, right? You could be looking at it through Microsoft or through Amazon or Google to be using your MSA that you happen to have with them, which is the way that like most large companies do this. They don't do their business directly with Anthropic. They will do it with the cloud vendor with whom they already have a master services agreement, because it includes things like that kind of insurance and security and all that sort of stuff. It becomes one of the reasons you work with a major cloud vendor. So the issue of privacy is going to be how much do you trust any of the nodes along this chain? In my case, it was working with Anthropic, working with Xano, working with Vectura. Excuse me. And how you trust the transports that they're using along the way. And for each of them, you have controls over deciding who you want to do business with, right? And how much trust you have in those people you're doing business with. And like you can pull levers like deciding to work through, say, Microsoft. So you have those insurance guarantees rather than just working directly through Anthropic or what have you. You have the ability to do configuration, decide whether or not things are going to be shared versus not. But those become the ways that you can pull those levers. I don't worry about it that much. Once I turn off the go share it with somebody else, for the purpose of myself or a small company, I think it's perfectly adequate. For a large company or a hospital or a medical institution or something, they're going to care a lot more about making sure it's done through like a good vendor. And that's when you use the cloud vendor and make sure that the other nodes in your chain are like HIPAA and SOC 2 compliant rather than the more basic levels.
So at the end, we are responsible for what we share, actually. So it remains in our hands, right?
But we need to remember though, there's one more link in the chain I hadn't thought about yet, which was the user, right? So if you are a vendor and you're exposing your data to a user, right, is that the right user who gets access to that? This is one of the reasons why the security stuff that Shane was asking about is so important, right? That being able to say, hey, just this person gets this information so that the right people get the right information and don't have access to the wrong information. This was a nightmare. A year ago, I was at a conference and talking to people about, they were piloting Microsoft Copilot, right? Which is their generalized, let's take SharePoint and your documents, whatever, let's load it up and make it available through an AI chatbot. And oh my goodness, people could find out what their colleagues were making, right? They could find out what their what their recruiting strategies were, like all sorts of stuff they shouldn't have had access to, they had access to. And that issue of governance and access is actually a big question. And that's not something the AI can do for you. That's the kind of thing you want to do deterministically. But then, subject to being valid for this person to look at, you can serve up to the AI so it can be creating more business value for the people.
Thank you guys. I know we're just a little bit over on time. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for coming, and we're going to make it a habit. So next week, Wednesday, 1 p.m., it would be amazing. You are all welcome, of course, to stop by again. And thank you all. Really, it was all great questions, and it was just a pleasure from my side.
Absolutely.
Likewise,
Hey,
thank
hey,
you all.
Great. What was that?
Thank
just to
you.
ask, the future sessions, are you up on Luna yet?
I'm going to put up on Luna. Yes.
Okay.
I'll put them up
Very
for sure.
Take it.
See you.